Oh yeah, that's Trashy. A podcast from Office Supply Publishing and Closet Gunpoint. I'm your host, Christopher J. Garcia.
It's all so trashy. Trashy, trashy. We're living in a world that's trashy. Trashy, trashy.
When I was a kid, I liked to read. Funny thing is, I would say the majority of my reading didn't come from the library where my mom worked, but instead from a supermarket. The magazine racks, I'd pick up People, Us Weekly, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, but it was right at the checkout stand where my favorite was. And in the early and mid-1980s, that was the National Enquirer. To this day, when someone says the National Enquirer, you know what they're talking about. Sensationalistic stories. Gossip. But they're not that anymore. And the whole history of the Enquirer is a 100-year story that ties back to some of the most significant moments in the last century. And what I love is that it proves that once you're stained with an idea, it sticks with you, even if you're doing real good journalism after. So come on. Let's take a look at the National Enquirer and exactly why it's always been trashy. It's 1926, and a guy who was sort of a protege of legendary yellow journalist William Randolph Hearst, William Griffin, decided he wanted to found a paper. And he actually got money lent to him by Hearst. Hearst controlled so many major papers around the country that having him on your side was a good thing, and so Griffin founded the New York Evening Enquirer. And this was a Sunday afternoon piece, and it was distributed throughout New York City. It started September 19th, 1926. Now, what's interesting is that it was a symbiotic relationship between Hearst and Griffin. Because what Hearst was doing was using the New York Evening Enquirer as a way of sort of testing things out. See if his new ideas could actually work in a paper. Now, the less successful idea, they stuck with the Enquirer, but sort of the rest got absorbed into the Hearst papers. This is actually something that happens a lot in the trashy set of the world. WWE is an excellent example. They had a relationship with ECW. The stuff that really worked came to WWF at that point, and the stuff that didn't sort of stuck around. You can see this in films. Film studios do this. You can see this all over the place. And it's very effective. And it usually is the leader in a field funding a upstart to act as that proving ground. Effective. It works. Now, since it was using the less successful ideas, it didn't really take off. It was never a huge deal. And it might not have helped that the Enquirer in the 30s and 40s was pretty much a fascist paper. That's not entirely true. It was definitely pro-fascist and highly isolationist. But a lot of the country was at that point. Certainly not the most of them, but certainly during the 30s, there was a large isolationist population here because of what had happened during World War I. And Griffin actually wrote editorials against U.S. military involvement in World War II, which led to an indictment for violating the Smith Act for sedition. Now, of course, the charges were dropped on that, but there were a lot of folks who were charged with violation of the Smith Act. Most of them didn't go anywhere, but some did. And it really did change how journalists approached writing about opposition to the war. Of course, the war happened, and they came out of it, and they were still around. And Griffin died in 1949. But by that point, the paper's circulation was down to less than 20,000. So here's where it gets really interesting. Generoso Pope, Jr. in this case, was the son of a newspaper publisher who published Il Progresso. And that was the Italian language newspaper that was very popular in New York. I can remember seeing it in The Godfather. I think I'm sitting on one of the tables and wondering what that was and looking it up. Now, what's funny is that Pope purchased the Enquirer, and it's said that it ended up being financed with money from Frank Costello of the Luciano crime family. Who knows if that's true or not. But what's interesting is that supposedly the promise was that the Enquirer would, 1, publish lottery numbers, and 2, it wouldn't mention mafia activities. That's an important thing to remember. The mob were trying to somewhat legitimize themselves, at least in view. If no one reported on one of their murders, the murder didn't happen. They understood the power of the media better than most. And that actually comes into play later in the story as well. Now, what's great is at this point, Popa actually changed the format and turned it into a tabloid and made it salacious. And the mayor Robert Wagner, who I didn't know was the mayor of New York City before he killed Natalie Wood, he actually got so annoyed he forced the publisher to resign from the Board of Higher Education in 1954. Now, it wasn't until 1957 that the New York Evening Enquirer or New York Sunday Enquirer became the National Enquirer. And that was a big change because it went from being a New York publication to being a national publication. And that is big. At this point, for the most part, all reporting is local. We're just starting to see the rise of national TV networks. National papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they were sort of nationally distributed, but they weren't the big deal. In papers, in fact, it really wasn't until USA Today that there was a national paper. You had national radio networks, but they were still sort of locally focused. So it was a very interesting time, and becoming a magazine in the newspaper space, a tabloid regardless, definitely showed how forward-looking the Enquirer was. Now, it was up against things like Confidential, police stories, magazines that were usually with lurid covers that I love, and stories of murder, violence, so on and so forth. Some of them true, some of them not. True Confessions is one of the ones that had the most impact, and we'll do an episode on that too. They really worked to get the paper selling. And it had insanely outrageous and kind of gory headlines in the 50s and 60s. I cut out her heart and stomped on it from 1963, and Mom boiled her baby and ate her from 1962. These were true stories, but they were sensationalized to a point where the abstraction may as well made them fake. Now, by the mid-1960s, they're selling about 1 million copies, but it's pretty much only being sold on newsstands and in drugstores. And this is where the supermarket comes in. The supermarket was a relatively new idea in the 1960s, and it was really the 1950s and 60s where you started to see the proliferation. Because you had Piggly Wiggly, you had Albertsons, Safeway, but they really started expanding aggressively at this point. Part of this is the suburbanization of America. And so, the idea was they would change the format of the paper. They would get rid of the gore and the violence, and they would focus on celebrities, the occult, and UFOs. That changed everything. Let's take each one of those things sort of in their own way. Celebrity gossip was not new, even when the Enquirer was founded. In fact, by 1955, America had already had the single greatest gossip piece ever written, Kenneth Anger's Hollywood Babylon. Gossip about celebrities has always existed, and, for better or worse, has always managed to sell. By focusing on that instead of the gory crime stuff, they made their things more approachable. They could use images of celebrities on their cover as a way of drawing people's attention. UFOs, ghosts, and paranormal has always been an attraction, and particularly in the 50s, very big. There was a huge explosion in the 1950s of interest in UFOs, of course, because of things that happened in the 40s, the term flying saucer being coined in 1947. In the 50s, 60s, very much a rising tide, and it was in the 70s that really UFO lore exploded everywhere. But the occult is interesting. Stories of the occult in newspapers date way back. You can even find, if you look at papers from the 19th century, you can see people just listing, oh, we have a seance coming up, come along, or actually reviews of seance or magical rituals. There's a very famous review of a ritual done by Aleister Crowley that was carried in major papers. This is something that the Dead Authors podcast mentioned, and I looked up, and damned if they weren't right. What's amazing is that all of those have had their time, and they were all seen as trashy topics. What's really interesting is that it was the occult, starting in the late 70s, but definitely running through the 80s when it reached its peak, had the satanic panic. And the Enquirer was a big part of that. They were hyping up all of these stories about, kids who were being ritualistically abused. The McMartin preschool case, for example, was covered extensively in the Enquirer. When it started to get huge was in 1977 with the death of Elvis Presley. And that became a breaking story that every weekly issue, they would talk about. They would interview the doctor. They would publish color photographs of his body in the casket. They would have articles about how Lisa Marie Presley was dealing with this, about his drug use. It's not unexpected that the rumors of him faking his death, I don't know if they were directly started by the Enquirer, but they certainly played along for a while. Now, by the 80s and into the 90s, it was a huge deal. 5 million people, 5 million copies were being sold every week. That's a huge number. And of course, there were other spin-offs. Star, which was definitely more focused on celebrity than on the sort of the trashy stuff. And you had the Weekly World News, which was way out there. In a way, it was parody. But in another way, it was legitimate. And we'll be talking about that a lot, because I think Weekly World News is a really interesting story about how Americans deal with news overload. Now, the company was sold to McFadden for $412 million. I think that was in 1990. In 1999, it was sort of the end of the big period, of the hottest period, but in 2001. But in 1984, a big thing happened. Now, it's no secret that the Enquirer paid their sources. They bought their news, which, for better or worse, works. The better part of that is it means they could have a steady stream, and people who would normally be reluctant to talking because of their position will talk to you for a little bit of money. The flip side of that, of course, is there are conflicts of interest, as people could be saying things just to get the money instead of actually, having the information, and it becomes contingent on the publisher to do good fact-checking. They weren't the best about that. By the 1980s, questionable content, they had definitely fed into the satanic panic. They had definitely fed into sort of conspiracy theory stuff. Not like Pizzagate, but they were happy to talk about divorced stars and their personal relationships. They were happy to talk about drugs, all these sort of things. But then something fascinating happens. And in 1987, Gary Hart was the frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination. Now, for a long time, Hart was sort of known as a playboy, but the mainstream media wasn't touching him. It was still considered off limits to do that sort of thing, but the Enquirer followed him, and they caught a picture, and this is what I'm not 100% certain of, is how they acquired that picture. And there's a famous photograph of Donna Rice, his mistress, sitting on Gary Hart's lap on a boat called The Monkey Business. And everything blew up for the Hart campaign. This was a legitimate news story, but at the same time it was being reported by a legitimate news source. And this wasn't the first time they would have major impact on an election. But Hart was the front runner. and he was completely defeated in 88. He was out of the race. Would Hart have beaten Bush? I don't know. But that definitely did change the course. They actually got a little more legitimate as the new millennium came about. They were still paying sources. They were still running some stuff, but they were doing more actual reportage. Now, here's the thing. They reported that John Edwards had been having an affair with Rel Hunter. Riel? Lord Rael. No. And, he had been a presidential candidate, and he admitted to having the affair, but denied fathering her child. But the thing is, the affair had first been reported in the Enquirer. In particular, back in 2006, when they got the information from a filmmaker hired by Edwards. Now, 2008, they run this article claiming to have caught the former North Carolina senator visiting L.A. to see his girlfriend and her kid. This was huge. And a lot of people thought that this investigation was worthy of the Pulitzer. The San Francisco Examiner actually said something really terrifying. It galls most mainstream newspaper editors that a tawdry tabloid could be considered for the most vaunted prize. It's like nominating a porn flick for an Oscar. And to me, that is absolutely ridiculous. It is the mainstream media saying, they can't do good work, but they can. I like to remember that Rosemary's Baby was produced by Roger Corman. You can make good stuff even if you're on the lower level. To me, it's utter arrogance to say otherwise. There are some other famous stories, of course. Sarah Palin's daughter, who had an exclusive account of the pregnancy of Bristol Palin. And it's a number of things there that were questionable. But at the same time, they were doing reporting and they were buying sources, which I think is the most important thing you can do. I'm not going to lie. The buying of information by journalists has been going on a long, long time. The Enquirer made it their modus operandi. It was how they did it. And an entire industry now exists. Gawker. TMZ, of course, being the most famous. Hell, I sold something to TMZ. I sold a photo one. But there's way more to it. And they're actually doing journalism with that information. Now, David Perel was one of the most interesting editors you could ever have. And it's really interesting. Ennis Cosby, who is Bill Cosby's son, was murdered. And the Enquirer offered a $100,000 reward for the arrest and conviction of whoever killed him. That, of course, I don't even think it's an ethical gray area. I think it's just unethical. That said, the paper's investigative unit, which Perel had formed, published that Jesse Jackson had fathered a love child during his marriage. Now, that idea was a big deal. But Perel had put together this group that was really good at investigating. Their coverage of the OJ case. The New York Times called it the Bible of the case. It wasn't doing it for the greater good. It was doing it for money, of course. But that doesn't make the work they did any less valuable. Now, what's incredible is that in the Cosby case, the LA police actually credited the Enquirer for solving the case. Here's a quote. "We have just arrested a suspect for the murder of Ennis Cosby, going on information we are very confident about, and that was in great part due to the help from the National Enquirer. Putting the money out there helped." There was no question. They still do some stuff that's really super sketchy. Of course, the most important one to me is that the Enquirer ran a story in 2016 saying that Ted Cruz's father, Raphael, knew JFK's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, and worked with Oswald, leading to the questionable Cruz's dad killing JFK stories. No. There's lots of sort of things, and they got very, very different sort of work later. It's very clear that they are now backing right-wing politicians as long as they're Donald Trump. Because they killed a story from Karen McDougal about an affair she had with Trump in 2006. And they bought the story from McDougal and killed it. Here's the important line here. They paid $150,000 for exclusive life rights to any relationship she has had with a then married man. It was hush money. It really was. They did the same thing with Stormy Daniels, although that payment situation didn't involve the Enquirer. But they didn't run stories about it. They were buying stories about Trump, negative stories about the garbage that he did. And he did all these things. Let's be clear about that. These are not salacious rumors. These are first-hand stories that are being purchased to be snuffed out. This is a big deal. And it's interesting in how you could defend that. One, the stuff that Perel and others were doing in investigating things like Ennis Cosby or Edwards or any of that proves that the Enquirer is in fact a legitimate journalist source. But on the other side, the killing of these stories, and many more, really make questionable whether or not they are journalism. The argument is, in many ways, that what the Enquirer is doing is entertainment. This is the same defense that Fox News makes of itself. Now, it's not to be said they haven't lost lawsuits. They lost one in 1981 to Carol Burnett. I had never heard this. I knew that Carol Burnett had been involved in a lawsuit, but this is great. Burnett, they claimed, had been seen drunk in public at a restaurant with Henry Kissinger. I had no idea. And apparently she had not. Ian Calder, in a book called The Untold Story, said that under his leadership, they worked hard to check the reliability of facts and sources while still paying for them. It was really the OJ stuff, the OJ coverage, which included being the first ones to identify the shoes, the Bruno Magli shoes, that really turned people sort of onto them as a legitimate journalist source. And that's interesting. You never really saw that from things like Confidential, True Confessions, any of that. That was never considered journalism. And reading the things, I've read a lot of those true crime magazines of the 1950s and 60s. While they were clearly doing some of the stuff that the Enquirer was doing, the Enquirer was clearly going for a more of a journalistic bent. They've been sued for libel many times by a lot of people. And they've bought a lot of material. And the idea of checkbook journalism is dangerous on one hand and highly useful on another. But we also have to remember, Abraham Zapruder sold the film to Life magazine. And the understanding of the JFK assassination, a lot of it comes from that film, even though it took a while for it to get out. I think he sold the stills to Life magazine, and then the eventual footage, I think, showed on CBS. It's huge and important. I don't know if checkbook journalism has made media better or worse. It has certainly led to the rise of the paparazzi in the U.S. At the same time, it has exposed so much that would have gone unseen. Well, today, as I record this, we had the murder of the young woman in Minneapolis by an ICE agent. If people weren't out there recording everything, and checkbook journalism, TMZ, all of that, the rise of social media, all of that makes that more important, makes that happen, builds that concept. If that hadn't happened, we may not know what actually happened about that dude murdering her. By the way, I don't pull punches. He murdered her. Period. And Trump is a rapist. Do with that what you will. As time has gone on, the Enquirer has become less important. Because of TMZ, Gawker, all the other things that have happened. That really sort of took off from where it started. But I think one of the most important things is that the Enquirer proves, again, you can have very different start from a very different peak. And you can have a very different peak from your finish. Jerry Springer. That's the same arc. Slightly longer, just because of the time frame. So in September, we'll be celebrating 100 years of the National Enquirer. And that's special. If you want to know how it all happened, I'll have some links in the show notes. Because inquiring minds want to know. Thank you for listening to Trashy. I'm loving doing this one, and I'm going to do some research for this next one that I think y'all will enjoy. Because we're going to the 2000s, and we're going to be looking at Jersey Shore as one of the first of our looks at MTV's role in making trash TV more than just one or two sensationalist pieces. So I hope you'll stay tuned. Trashy is written, produced, recorded, hosted, and all the other stuff by Christopher J. Garcia. Drop a line, johnnyeponymous@gmail.com, or join our Patreon. We're a part of the 3 Minute Modernist family. Thanks for listening to Trashy. If you love it and hate yourself for it, the odds are it's trashy.
It's all so trashy, 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 trashy. We're living in a world that's trashy, 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 trashy. It's all so trashy, trashy, trashy.